There's three main pieces to your home insurance policy that are probably more important than the rest. Obviously, the whole policy matters and it makes sense if you're a new homeowner or you have had your home insurance for a while and you're just wondering, what are the main things I need to focus on my home insurance? Let's go into the three main pieces that you need to focus on. I'll also link a video at the end that'll go more in depth that goes over all of the pieces of the homeowner's policy. The first and most important piece of the home insurance is, do you have the right coverage? And when I say coverage, it's really the dwelling. So dwelling affects everything. It's coverage A if you look at a policy, that's the name of it, and it's coverage A, dwelling. And that dwelling part is what sets the tone for everything else for the majority. So when you look at a policy, that A, let's just say your house was a $300,000 house. Typically, the B, which is your other structures, so fence, shed, anything else that's on the property that's not the house, that's not directly connected, that's going to be the B, and that's 10% of A. Now, you can raise it and lower it with some companies, so if you don't have a fence or shed or anything that you need covered, sometimes you can remove it altogether. Depends on the insurance company. You want to talk with your local agent to find out if that is removable with your current policy. Coverage C and D, and all of those, there's 70% of A and 30% of A, and there's all of these parts that come into play, and then it starts getting into medical and other pieces outside of that. So understanding that you have the right replacement cost of your home is probably the most important, because if there is a fire, if something happens, something major and you want the house covered, if you're not covered correctly, you could be out thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on your home insurance. One little side note, coverage A is to have what's called full replacement and then extended replacement. So going beyond what you would normally carry, because inflation hits and lumber costs more at certain times of the year, and there's all of these pieces depending on when you might have a claim, is having an additional coverage in case you don't have enough, even with it being enough today. Doesn't mean it's going to be enough in 3 months or 5 months. You want to have that additional replacement cost that kicks in and pays the difference up to the amount that you've set in case you do have a major or a total loss in those situations. The second most important part of a homeowner's policy is to have what's called a comprehensive policy. That really is just like the coverage, because there's comprehensive, there's name perils, there's open perils, there's all sorts of policies. So there's technically three types of home insurance. You've got what's called an HO2, an HO3, and an HO5. Now there are some other ones or sub ones that you can look at, but those are the main ones. The HO2 almost no one does. It's just not a common policy. We're just going to talk about the HO3 because that's really the main one that everybody does. And when I say everybody, I'd say 95% to 99%. The HO5 starts to get into more of your higher value homes, to where you want just to have kind of a broader policy. Again, even when you have the $1 million, $2 million houses, 9 times out of 10, you're going to do the HO3. And almost everything is covered on there. They're going to have their exclusions, they're going to have their coverage. The main things that you're going to notice that you're not going to have coverage for is if you have earthquake or earth movement is common to be excluded, or if you have water or hurricane that comes through. In certain states like Michigan, not really as much of a concern, but it's still something to think about. And you can add, in addition to that, a flood policy, which is just a totally separate policy. So if you want to be covered in case water comes up into the home, there's an additional policy that covers that excluded portion in another coverage. And the third most important, and I think this is probably the most important, even though we talked about coverage A being the most important, that's covering the house. The liability is the most important to cover you and protect you as an income. What is the liability? The liability is essentially the coverage for you in case something happens where you're going to be considered at fault or you're liable, where you're the one to blame, so to speak, or your house is to blame. You essentially own the house can't take the blame, so it falls on you. If somebody gets hurt, slips on your driveway, a piece of the ceiling fell off, something happened and just injured somebody, sometimes slander can be considered part of that if you have it listed on the policy correctly. And all of that type of coverage is if somebody's going to go after you, if they're going to sue you, so to speak, and they're going to go after that liability portion. It's not always just the case where it has to be someone going after you. It could be more so even a friend or family comes over, they get hurt and they get injured. You typically have what's called med pay, medical payments, and that would cover some of those injuries. But if it runs out and you only have $1,000, which is very common, or even $5,000, let's say there was a $20,000 bill because they had to spend the night in the hospital. Something major happened, they slipped down the stairs over someone's shoes, or whatever the case is, yeah, they're still your friend, but they still have to be covered and compensated for the injury that happened on your property. In that scenario, they're going to go after your insurance and go after the liability portion instead of going after you. You don't want your insurance to have you be the primary person to go after. That's why you purchase that policy, is to protect yourself in those situations. So all that hard-earned money that you've earned, you've stocked away, you've saved, the assets that you have, the cars, everything that you've built your life around is protected by that liability portion in case somebody goes after you. Now, that's not to say that doesn't run out and then go after you. That's where having the right agent and talking with them about what your risks are, your risk tolerance, to what coverage you should carry. If you are shopping around, I'll put a link in the description below where you can get a quote with us. We'd love to help you out. We're in a ton of states, so if we're available, we'd love to help you. Feel free to ask questions below. Always, like I promised, if you want to go further in depth on the home, here's a video that will go in depth on that. If you're just trying to save a couple dollars and want to look over some discounts, here's a video that will go over some discounts as well. I'm Mark with Valor Insurance. We'll see you soon.